I work as a bartender at a hotel lounge downtown, and for almost 2 years my shift ended at 1 in the morning, which meant I was always catching the very last train home. I want to say up front that I've ridden that train more nights than I can count, and until this happened, nothing about it ever struck me as unusual. I live in a city with a subway system that runs almost around the clock, except for a short window overnight when service drops to a single train every 40 minutes on my line. That last train is a different animal from the daytime crowd, mostly other late shift workers, the occasional drunk person sleeping it off, and transit employees heading home themselves. My commute was 6 stops from downtown to my neighborhood, about 25 minutes if the train didn't sit at any red signals along the way. I always sat in the second car from the front, out of habit more than anything, because that car had a working heater in the winter, and I'd learned that the hard way after freezing through an entire December in the back car instead. I knew a handful of regulars by sight, not by name, just the way you recognize people from routine, without ever actually speaking to them. There was an older man who always got off at the stop before mine carrying a violin case, a woman in scrubs who read paperback romance novels the entire ride, and a transit worker who sometimes rode home in his uniform with his badge still clipped to his belt. The night this happened started completely normal. It was a Thursday, slow at the bar, and I left almost exactly on time. Badge scanned at the turnstile at 12:51 according to the little digital clock above the gate, a detail I only remember because I glanced at it out of boredom. The platform was nearly empty, just me and maybe 3 other people scattered along the length of it, which was typical for that hour. When the train pulled in, I got into my usual car and sat near the middle, and that's when I first noticed him, though at the time he didn't register as anything worth thinking about. He was sitting near the far end of the car, a man in a plain gray jacket with the hood down, maybe somewhere in his 30s. Nothing distinctive about him at all. He wasn't doing anything except sitting there with his hands folded in his lap, staring straight ahead at nothing in particular, and I genuinely gave him about 2 seconds of attention before going back to my phone. At the second stop, a handful of people got off and nobody new got on, which also wasn't strange for that hour. I noticed him again only because the car had gotten so much emptier that he was harder not to notice, still sitting in the same spot, still staring straight ahead, hands still folded the exact same way. By the third stop, the car had thinned out to just me, him, and one other person who got off at that very stop, leaving just the 2 of us. I remember feeling a small flicker of unease, the kind you get being alone with a stranger late at night. But I told myself that was just normal caution, not anything specific about him. That's when I noticed he had moved. He was no longer at the far end of the car, but 2 rows closer, sitting on the same side as me now, still in that same folded hand posture, still staring straight ahead, like he hadn't actually gotten up and repositioned himself at all. I don't believe in getting spooked over nothing, and I told myself I'd simply misjudged where he'd originally been sitting, that memory plays tricks on you late at night after a long shift on your feet. I put my earbuds in, turned my music up, and tried to focus on anything other than the empty car and the man 2 rows away. At the 4th stop, nobody got on, which is where things stopped feeling explainable. The doors opened, stayed open the usual few seconds, and closed again on an empty platform. And when I looked up from my phone, he was one row behind me now, still facing forward, still perfectly still, as if he had simply always been sitting there. I hadn't heard him move at all, not a single footstep, not the sound of a subway seat creaking under someone shifting their weight. The car was dead silent except for the normal rattle of the train itself, and I would have heard footsteps in that silence. I'm certain of that even now. I glanced toward the front of the car where the small window into the operator's compartment sits, hoping to catch someone's attention. But the light back there was off, and I couldn't tell if anyone was even watching. I decided I would simply get off at the next stop, regardless of whether it was mine, because staying on that train suddenly felt like the worst possible option. At the fifth stop, one stop before my usual one, the doors opened and an older woman in a work uniform stepped on. The first new passenger in what felt like forever, and I have never in my life felt so relieved to see a stranger. She sat near the front of the car, glanced back once toward where I was sitting, and her face changed in a way I noticed immediately. She asked me, quietly, if the man sitting behind me was bothering me, and when I turned to check where he had moved again, now directly across the aisle from me instead of behind me, still in that same unnervingly still posture. She said she'd seen him from the platform before boarding, sitting in that exact seat, and that something about how he was sitting had made her hesitate before getting on at all. That was the moment I stopped telling myself I was imagining anything. We were two people now, both watching the same impossible thing happen, and I have never been so grateful for a total stranger's confirmation in my life. The train slowed for my stop, and as the doors opened, I heard a voice, low and almost pleasant, say my name, clear as anything, from somewhere close behind me. I have never given that man my name. I have never spoken to him at all. And there was no ID badge, no name tag, nothing on me that would have told a stranger who I was. I didn't turn around. I grabbed my bag and ran straight through the doors just as they started to close, and I didn't stop moving until I was up the stairs and standing under a streetlight at the corner, breathing so hard I thought I might be sick. The woman from the train came up behind me a minute later, having apparently gotten off at the same stop, despite it not being hers either, and admitted she'd never actually intended to leave the train there at all. She said she just didn't want to be the only one left in that car with him. I called the transit authority's non-emergency line the next morning, mostly hoping someone could pull camera footage and at least tell me who he was. The woman on the phone was polite, but clearly uninterested, telling me that without a specific complaint of harassment or an actual crime, there wasn't much they could investigate, and that homeless individuals sometimes ride the last trains overnight to stay warm, which she seemed to think explained everything. I went back to that platform 2 days later during daylight hours, mostly to prove to myself the whole thing had a boring explanation, and found something on the bench where I usually wait that made my stomach drop, scratched faintly into the paint of the metal armrest, small enough that you'd only notice if you were looking closely, was my first name, spelled correctly, in letters that looked etched rather than written. I switched my route home after that night, adding almost 20 extra minutes to my commute by taking a longer bus line instead, and I never saw that man again. I never found out who he was, whether he was even a real living person riding a real train or something else entirely that happened to look like one that night. I still worked the same late shift at the same bar, and some nights, waiting on an empty platform for the last train, I catch myself watching the tunnel a little too closely for a train that isn't due yet. I don't know what I actually saw moving closer to me car after car that night, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to. I worked the graveyard security shift at a downtown office tower for almost 2 years before anything strange ever happened there. Up until that point, the job was the most boring thing I had ever done, and I mean that as a compliment. I want to say that up front because I think it matters. I wasn't the kind of person who saw shadows and panicked. I was the opposite. I used to tease people for being scared of empty buildings. The tower was called the Halloran Building, 20-some floors of law offices, an insurance company, and a handful of smaller businesses that rented out single suites. By 7 in the evening, the place emptied out completely. I liked it that way. I took the job because I was finishing my degree during the day and needed something quiet at night that still paid the bills. Overnight security in an empty office building sounded perfect. Sit at a desk, watch a bank of monitors, walk the floors every couple hours, log it, repeat. My coworker Doug had been there almost 9 years. He trained me on everything, the elevator quirks, which stairwell door stuck, how the cameras on the 9th floor always had a little static because of some electrical issue nobody ever fixed. He also told me about Walt. Walt was a man who slept near the loading dock most nights. He never came inside, never bothered anyone, just kept warm by the vents and moved along before the morning crew showed up. Doug swore up and down the guy was harmless, said building management had basically adopted him as an unofficial mascot over the years. I never had a problem with Walt. He'd nod at me through the dock window sometimes, and that was the extent of our relationship. In hindsight, I think about him a lot more now than I did back then. My routine was simple. Clock in at 11, do a walk of all floors by midnight, sit at the desk watching the monitors, do another walk around 2 in the morning, then again around 4:30 before the day shift relieved me at 6. Most nights nothing happened at all. That was the appeal. The 14th floor was the one that always felt a little off to me, though I never said that out loud to anyone. It had been vacated by a law firm that downsized, and management hadn't found a new tenant yet. Empty floors just sit there collecting dust, chairs still pushed in, phones still plugged into jacks nobody uses. Doug got sick that October, some kind of flu that knocked him out for almost 2 weeks, and because we were short-staffed, I ended up covering every single overnight shift alone. I want to be honest, I didn't think twice about it. I needed the extra hours for tuition, and an empty building had never scared me before. The first strange thing happened on the 3rd night alone. The motion sensor on 14 tripped at exactly 3:14 in the morning, according to the log, which struck me as oddly specific even then. I walked up to check it and found nothing, just the same empty floor, same rows of dead cubicles. I told myself it was probably a bird against a window, or the building settling the way old buildings do. I did notice, though, that one of the office chairs was turned to face the hallway instead of the desk. I didn't remember it being like that on my last walk, but I also couldn't swear it hadn't always been that way. 2 nights later, the sensor tripped again, same floor, 3:14 on the log almost to the minute. This time when I got up there, a mug from the break room downstairs was sitting on the reception desk on 14, and when I picked it up, it was still slightly warm. Nobody was supposed to be in that building besides me. I checked the badge access log on the computer, and there was no record of any door opening on that floor all night. I remember standing there telling myself I was overreacting, that maybe I'd left the mug there myself and forgotten, even though I knew I hadn't. I don't believe in this stuff, but I started leaving the 14th floor off my walk route for a few nights, which is embarrassing to admit now, considering it was literally my job to check it. I told myself I was just being efficient. Looking back, I was being a coward. And I can say that about myself now with a little humor because nothing terrible actually happened to me directly, just to my nerves. The undeniable moment came on a Thursday. I was doing my 2 o'clock walk, and as I stepped into the stairwell between the 10th and 11th floor, I heard footsteps coming from above me, slow and deliberate, matching pace with mine whenever I moved, and stopping whenever I stopped. I called out, asked if Walt had somehow gotten inside, and got nothing back but silence. When I got back to the desk, shaking a little more than I wanted to admit, I flipped through the stairwell camera footage from the last hour. There was a figure on it, just a shape really, moving down from the 14th floor stairwell landing about 20 minutes before I'd started my walk. The picture quality was bad enough that I couldn't make out a face, only a shape and a slow, uneven way of walking. Management finally hired a second overnight guard to help cover while Doug recovered, a guy named Priya's cousin. I forget his name honestly. He only lasted about a week. On his third night, he came running down from the 12th floor, pale and out of breath, saying he'd seen someone standing perfectly still at the end of the hallway, and it wasn't until he'd looked away and looked back that the figure was gone. I hadn't told him anything about my own experiences before that happened, which is the part that actually convinced me something was really going on. He described the same slow, hunched way of standing that I'd caught a glimpse of on the stairwell camera. I decided to test it myself instead of just hoping I was imagining things. I put a strip of tape across the seam of the 14th floor stairwell door, low enough that nobody would notice it during a normal day, and checked it every night before my walk. 3 nights in a row, the tape was broken by the time I came back around, even on nights when the badge log showed the door had never been opened. I brought all of this to the property manager, expecting at the very least some concern about building security. Instead, I got a tired sigh and a comment about how old buildings creak and settle, and a reminder that motion sensors are notoriously unreliable in unused spaces. I called the police once after the footsteps in the stairwell, and they sent someone out who checked the doors, found no signs of forced entry, and told me there wasn't much they could do without evidence of an actual crime. The last night I worked there, I found something on the 14th floor that I still think about more than I want to. Written into the dust on the reception desk in careless block letters was my name, spelled correctly, which meant whoever wrote it knew who I was, and not just that a guard happened to be on shift. I didn't walk that floor again that night. I sat frozen at my desk until the badge log showed the elevator moving on its own, rising from the lobby up toward 14 without anyone having swiped in. I grabbed my things and left the building before my shift technically ended, and I never went back, not even to collect my final paycheck in person. Doug called me a few weeks later, mostly to check in, and I told him everything. He got quiet for a while, and then he told me something he probably should have mentioned earlier. Years before I was hired, there had been a security guard fired from the building for behavior the property manager described only as inappropriate around female tenants, and that guard had never returned his master key set. Nobody ever found out where that man went after he was let go. Walt disappeared from the loading dock around the same time I quit, and nobody at the building ever saw him again either. I don't know if those two things are connected, and I try not to think too hard about whether they are. I finished my degree, found a daytime job, and I sleep with my bedroom door locked now, even though I live alone in a perfectly safe apartment. Every so often I think about that mug still warm on an empty floor, or my name written into dust by someone who was never supposed to know it. I still don't have an answer for who or what was up there with me, and some nights that bothers me more than I'd like to admit. My name doesn't matter much to this story, but I'll say I was 26 years old when I signed the lease on my first solo apartment, a one-bedroom unit on the third floor of a converted brick building near the edge of downtown. I'd spent the 2 years before that living with roommates, and I was thrilled beyond words to finally have a place entirely to myself. The building was called the Aldridge, 4 floors total, maybe 20 units, built sometime in the 1930s, according to the leasing agent, with the kind of charm that comes from old radiators and slightly uneven hardwood floors. I loved it immediately. The tall windows, the crown molding, the fact that my rent was almost $200 less than anywhere comparable in the neighborhood. I moved in on a Saturday in early spring with the help of my brother and a rented truck, and by that evening I had my mattress set up, my kitchen boxes half unpacked, and a genuine sense of pride in having my own space for the first time in my adult life. The building was quiet that first night. The good kind of quiet. The kind that comes from settling into somewhere new. My unit was 304, and above me sat Unit 404, directly matching my own floor plan one level up, according to the building layout posted near the mailboxes. I only noticed this detail because I happened to glance at the directory while checking my mailbox key, and it stuck with me only because it seemed like a mildly interesting bit of trivia, nothing more. For the first week, everything about the building felt exactly as advertised, peaceful, a little old-fashioned, populated by a handful of quiet neighbors I occasionally passed in the hallway. I met an elderly woman named Ruth on the second floor, who fed a stray cat by the side entrance, and a young couple on my own floor who worked opposite shifts and rarely overlapped enough to say more than a passing hello. The first sound came about 10 days after I moved in, around 11 at night while I was reading in bed. It was footsteps, slow and heavy, coming from directly above my bedroom ceiling, moving in a short back and forth pattern like someone pacing a room. I didn't think much of it at first, since old buildings carry sound strangely, and I assumed I simply had a new upstairs neighbor I hadn't met yet. I made a mental note to introduce myself sometime, went back to my book, and thought nothing more of it that night. The footsteps came back 2 nights later, this time closer to 1 in the morning, and this time accompanied by a low dragging sound, like a piece of heavy furniture being pulled slowly across a wooden floor. It went on for almost 10 full minutes, stopping and starting in irregular bursts before going completely silent. I mentioned it in passing to the building's leasing office the next afternoon, mostly out of curiosity about who my new upstairs neighbor might be, and the woman at the desk gave me a strange look before checking her computer. She told me, somewhat flatly, that Unit 404 had been vacant for almost 8 months, ever since the previous tenant moved out, and that no lease had been signed since. I laughed it off and told her that was strange, since I'd definitely heard someone up there multiple nights in a row, and she simply shrugged and said, "Maintenance sometimes used empty units for storage overnight," which struck me as a reasonable enough explanation at the time. I went home that evening telling myself the mystery was solved, nothing more than a maintenance crew moving boxes around after hours. The sounds continued almost every few nights after that, though never on any predictable schedule I could pin down. I don't believe in getting worked up over creaky old buildings, and for a while I genuinely convinced myself this was simply what living in a nearly 100-year-old building sounded like. About 3 weeks in, the footsteps started happening during hours that made the maintenance explanation harder to believe. Sometimes as early as 9 in the evening, sometimes as late as 3:14 in the morning, according to the digital clock on my nightstand, which I'd started checking almost reflexively every time the noise woke me. Maintenance crews, as far as I knew, didn't typically work in the middle of the night moving furniture in an empty apartment. I brought this up again at the leasing office, more insistent this time, and got a slightly different answer from a different employee who told me the previous tenant in 404 had left somewhat abruptly and that some of their furniture was, in fact, still sitting in the unit awaiting removal by a storage company. This at least explained the dragging sounds in a mundane way, and I accepted it because it was easier than the alternative. The next escalation happened almost 6 weeks after I moved in. I woke up around 2 in the morning to the unmistakable sound of a chair scraping directly above my bed, followed immediately by 3 sharp knocks on what sounded like a wooden floor, evenly spaced, almost rhythmic. I lay completely still, staring at my ceiling, and I swear the knocking paused for a moment right after I shifted in bed, as though whatever was up there had heard me move. I told myself that was impossible, that sound doesn't travel that precisely between floors, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being listened to right back. I decided, after that night, that I needed to actually see the inside of that apartment for myself, instead of relying on secondhand explanations from a leasing office that seemed to change its story every time I asked. I went to the office in person and specifically requested to view Unit 404, citing a supposed interest in eventually upgrading to a larger unit, which was a small lie, but felt necessary at that point. The leasing agent hesitated in a way that told me more than her actual words did, before eventually agreeing to walk me up there herself the following afternoon. When she unlocked the door to 404, the apartment was completely empty, not a single stick of furniture anywhere, dust coating the window sills in a thick, undisturbed layer that clearly hadn't been touched in months. There was no furniture waiting for a storage company, no boxes, nothing at all except bare hardwood floors and empty closets. The agent seemed genuinely confused herself, running her hand along a dusty countertop, like she was checking to make sure it was real, and admitted she didn't actually know why she'd been told there was leftover furniture in the first place. That night, I decided to test things myself instead of trusting anyone else's explanations. I set my phone down on the nightstand every night before bed, angled up toward the ceiling, recording audio through until morning, figuring at the very least I'd have proof of what I was hearing, even if I was too afraid to get up and check it myself. The first 2 nights, the recordings caught nothing worth mentioning, just my own breathing and a car passing outside once around midnight. On the third night, I woke to the dragging sound again, louder than before. And when I played the recording back the next morning, underneath the footsteps and the scrape of furniture, there was a low, steady voice, too quiet to make out any actual words, repeating itself in the same unhurried rhythm the whole time. I called the leasing office one final time, this time asking directly if anyone had a master key showing recent access to 404, since clearly someone or something was getting in there regardless of the vacancy paperwork. The office manager, a man I hadn't dealt with before, told me curtly that the building's access logs showed no entries to that unit in over 6 months, and that he found my repeated questions about an empty apartment somewhat unusual for a paying tenant with no actual complaint against building management. I called the police on my next particularly loud night, hoping an outside authority might take it more seriously than the leasing office had. The responding officer walked the building with me, checked the door to 404, found it locked with no signs of forced entry, and told me that sound often travels strangely through old pipes and radiators before leaving without much else to offer. I ran into Ruth, the elderly woman from the second floor, a few days later while she was feeding her usual stray cat by the side door, and mentioned everything to her, almost as an afterthought. Her expression shifted immediately, and she told me, in a lowered voice, that the previous tenant in 404 had been an older man who lived there alone for almost 11 years before dying suddenly in his sleep, and that his body hadn't been discovered for nearly a week afterward because he had no close family checking on him. She said the building had struggled to re-rent the unit ever since, not because of anything official, but because every prospective tenant who toured it backed out within days of signing, always citing vague discomfort they couldn't quite explain. She'd lived in the building long enough to remember all of it clearly, and she told me this with the flat, tired tone of someone who had stopped being surprised by any of it a long time ago. I moved out of the Aldridge less than 2 months after that conversation, breaking my lease early and eating the fee just to get out from under that ceiling. I never went back up to 404 again, and I never found anyone at the building willing to give me a straight answer about what was actually living in that empty apartment. I live somewhere else now, on a ground floor with nothing above me but roof, and I sleep better for it. Every so often, though, late at night in a completely different apartment, I catch myself listening to the ceiling out of habit, half expecting to hear something moving up there, even though I know for a fact there's nothing but empty sky above my head.